When we last met, we looked at different types of environmental disputes between sovereign states and the contextual factors, like joint democracy, economic integration, and membership in international institutions, that make them less likely to escalate to violence. This week, we'll begin a pivot to thinking more explicitly about the environment and how the environmental shocks, such as natural disasters, can both affect dynamics in ongoing conflicts, many of which do not have much of anything to do with disputes over the environment, and the sources of resilience to environmental shocks, both in terms of programming humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of government institutions. The world is in the midst of a humanitarian crisis not seen since World War II. As of January 2019, there are 71 million people who have been forced to flee their homes due to a combination of conflict, such as the conflicts in Syria and Yemen, and natural disasters, like droughts and floods. The effects for human security are dire. The 10 worst food crises of 2019, which collectively plunged 88.3 million people into near-famine-like conditions, all occurred in conflict-affected or fragile states, and many of those experienced additional acute stress due to failed harvests. These contexts present extraordinary challenges for people living in them, and for the humanitarian assistance organizations attempting to ease those people's suffering. These contexts are often referred to as complex emergencies, situations that combine internal conflict with large-scale displacement of people, mass famine or food shortage, and fragile or failing economic, political, and social institutions, often with their effects amplified further by natural disasters. Reasonable people do not hold the government responsible for earthquakes, typhoons, flash floods, and other rapid-onset disasters. Even insurance companies, for whom assigning blame is the key to guarding the bottom line, term such events acts of God, for which no one can be held accountable. People do, however, hold governments accountable for their preparations for and responses to disasters. Incumbent governments know this, and their responses are typically geared, in the aftermath of a natural disaster, toward shoring up political support among key constituencies. In functioning democracies, this tends to result in more effective post-disaster emergency response. So, for instance, research on emergency response to the 2002 Elbe River flood in Germany showed increased incumbent, i.e. people seated in office, vote shares in disaster-affected areas, and that effect carried over to elections 3 years later. Research in the United States has shown that swing states receive presidential disaster declarations, which can move billions of dollars, about twice as frequently as non-competitive states, given similar exposure to natural disasters. That is, disaster response, and COVID is really underlining this, is an inherently political process. It also gives greater incentives to engage in pre-disaster planning and governance strategies that lessen the harms associated with any given environmental shock. If you want to stay in office, you need to effectively address natural disasters. Now, in a natural disaster setting, the burdens of coping with that disaster are not borne equally. Writing in the journal Global Environmental Change, Susan Cutter argues that despite significant improvement in the livelihoods of the world's poor in the last 2 decades, women and children, 2 already vulnerable groups, have seen their vulnerability to natural disasters increase substantially. This is for a variety of reasons Cutter discusses, but one of the most important ones revolves around gendered patterns in employment and the differential burdens population displacement poses for women relative to men. Though women make up roughly half of displaced populations, both those populations displaced by conflict and by natural disasters, their rates of labor force participation are much lower than those of local, non-displaced women and displaced men. This is in part due to the gendered nature of many employment options available to the displaced. Especially in Africa, men are employed outside camps in much higher rates as laborers and on and off farms. But it's also due to the gendered nature of caregiving. Displaced populations tend to be disproportionately composed of the young and elderly, so a large share of displaced working-age women are engaged in uncompensated child or elder care. This has at least 3 effects. First, it makes women and children more dependent on humanitarian assistance. Second, it increases their dependence on male family members for income. And third, it can isolate women from social bonds and ties that might provide additional protection during normal times. One of the terrible results of all 3 being sexual assault and gender violence against women, perpetrated both by some humanitarian responders, but also by the men who affected women and children dare not leave in such uncertain, lean times.
Bana ile mfago. Mange hile mama kan gummi no man ngala kuna ngora fe school tara jana filana. Banata hela gamulle. Mungigen lana ze banata langigen ze mara. Oya sorana buga fu malama. Lega na gibera. Ana ma wurle zera na mara. Kan biji bana san min masakila gal san min sakila na kina jagarin. Ay ga friyan de goyela na san be ma bidur madersa. Ga friyan de goyela na san kan magir goledu. De rakin jam mata gir basa namba garar jam to. Wata lana fi betin da ma bigen murta. Ile kana rafu maldi bina kana ko lugo sabeta migen bu mun murta. Nerfanisco. Aja banar bekala zia matematik. Andara garam tala cica.
Anna bagara fi school wa mo. Ya sana na bigen be ko tayo de ma bigen mana kwes. Obi kore ana tala dawanga lan kan biga de katul badum bara makama jena sa. Ana silu zaman. Kamar gatawita? Ay gatama.
The mother is a young mother. Mostly when they are young, they tend to be small.
Sakila fi South Sudan. Anna jabes be itnin be ko tay bara. Mutu ligana dis ana so kerse bana la yele ko tay de. O ba turu sanu markan de melere wali de sun bi kan ba. Ila ta asan an bi indi zena ana kan de ramusu. Ana no asan bukun jena yan sunu gumas asan ana ba ki de am sokol so kerki da san saido. Kano raba kusuto school kan na fi chemin lisa.
Girna nono ko poita ko doga. Bunu charma kono nga. Ano wane ana beri gang ada ko gang kwan. Nyom chon beko. Ana beri kali latino perani yela na ade chunya beri kene kene. Pa no atama ni no ana tia ko gang kwana ka dong ana tia mabe. No nimbara kwa para bena loje. Never, I will never be a prayer, I will never be a, I will never be a.
These gendered patterns extend to armed conflicts as well. Men, especially young men, make up the vast majority of frontline fighting forces of both rebel and government armies. Even when women are among the combatants, they are typically outnumbered by men by large margins. As of the early 2000s, women made up more than 5% of the armed forces personnel in 6 of nearly 200 sovereign countries. So only 6 countries in the world did women make up more than 5% of the fighting force. Now, rebel forces are slightly more balanced in this respect, with female combatants making up more than 5% of the fighting forces in about 20% of rebel armed groups. But even when not directly fighting, women often perform significant roles in logistics and supply chains, even if those roles are poorly understood and under-recognized in post-conflict settings and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR, campaigns. DDR programs, which are intended to provide former fighters with the social and economic resources to help them return to society after potentially years of fighting and itinerant living, often wind up excluding women because they are not recognized as fighters. They may not be wielding weapons, but instead are moving money or information or food to frontline troops or providing safe havens and housing. Now, these logistics-oriented tasks mean they are less likely to be able to bring a firearm to DDR intake points, and thus less likely to receive access to benefits and social support. But as anyone in the military can tell you, a fighting force succeeds or fails largely on the stability and reliability of its supply chains. The so-called tooth-to-tail ratio, the ratio of frontline combatants to support staff, of the U.S. Army in Iraq in 2005 was roughly 3-to-1. For every troop dedicated to combat operations, there were 3 supporting them in logistics, command structures, or life support operations. Now let's return to the issue of how natural disasters affect conflict dynamics, first by looking at how conflicts might start and then how conflicts end. Natural disasters can certainly provide motive for participating in rebellion, or at least social unrest like protests and looting. The hardship created by natural disasters can fuel grievances, or the desire to make claims on the government, especially among already marginalized populations.
With the breach of 3 levees protecting New Orleans, the landscape of the city has changed dramatically, tragically, and perhaps irreversibly. There's now over 25 feet of water where there was once city streets and thriving neighborhoods.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. If you see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are black. And even for me to complain about, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've even been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give, and just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well off as slow as possible. I mean, Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us.
And subtle, but in even many ways more profoundly devastating, is the lasting damage to the survivors' will to rebuild and remain in the area. The destruction of the spirit of the people of southern Louisiana and Mississippi may end up being the most tragic loss of all.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Please call.
In the past few days, America and people have been stepping up to donate money, to do all they can to help people.
Ineffective disaster response can also expose the government's inability or unwillingness to help. It can expose corruption in ways that fuel rebellion. For instance, Nicaragua's Anastasio Somoza famously raided international disaster relief to the 1972 Managua earthquake, catalyzing middle-class and urban support for the opposition Sandinistas, who ultimately deposed Somoza violently in 1979. And while commonly cited as an example of an environmentally sparked conflict, the early 1990s Tuareg uprising in Mali was actually fueled largely by grievances not over the disaster per se, but over the embezzlement of international relief funds by Malian government officials and military officers. So, we can agree grievances are high after natural disasters, particularly when disaster response is highly politicized and further marginalizes already aggrieved groups. But if grievances are high, do these grievances translate into armed conflict? The answer is not always. Even if people have the motive to fight, they still need the capability to do so, and the hardships imposed by natural disasters may limit such capability. While poverty and marginal livelihoods can motivate participation in rebellion, hungry, desperate individuals without access to basic necessities do not make the most formidable fighters. This is one of the reasons that active food denial, attempts to starve enemy fighters and their civilian supporters, are often incorporated into counterinsurgency operations. Now, this dynamic can help explain the divergent paths of the Sri Lankan Civil War, which we've discussed at length before, and the Indonesian Civil War that pit the Indonesian government against the Free Aceh movement, better known by its Indonesian acronym GAM, an armed group fighting for the independence of the Aceh region and Acehnese ethnic group, in the aftermath of one of the worst natural disasters of the 21st century, the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004.
When the giant wave struck, some called it an act of God. Others saw it as nature at her most merciless. The earthquake and tsunami that devastated 11 Indian Ocean countries in December 2004 claimed an estimated 217,000 lives. Here, where the waves hit hardest, in the Indonesian province of Aceh, An estimated 164,000 were lost. More than 400,000 were displaced from their ruined homes and towns.
Triggered by a massive 9.3 on the Richter scale earthquake on the ocean floor, the Boxing Day tsunami inundated communities surrounding the coast of the Indian Ocean as far away as Tanzania, and the tsunami killed an estimated 230,000 people in 14 countries, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. The quake was in fact so strong it triggered aftershock quakes as far away as Alaska. The direct results caused major disruptions to living conditions and commerce in coastal communities of surrounding countries, particularly Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Thailand. It's really impossible to overstate the degree of devastation it caused, especially in the Aceh region of Indonesia and in the north of Sri Lanka. Now, similar to dynamics in Sri Lanka, Aceh had been seeing an increased influx of ethnically dominant Javanese and environmental degradation due to oil extraction, which, as in Nigeria, left the Achenese paying the environmental costs without seeing commensurate benefits from the resulting economic boom. Now, both the GAM and the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka had been actively waging war against their respective central governments for decades, and both of those battles had resulted in well over 10,000 deaths. At the time of the tsunami, there was little hope for resolution of the conflicts in either case, but within 6 months after the disaster, Indonesia was on a path to peace while Sri Lanka remained mired in conflict. In Indonesia, the parties held 5 successful rounds of peace negotiations under the guidance of a Finnish NGO, the Crisis Management Initiative, leading to a peace agreement in August 2005, demilitarization, and local elections that have provided the region with more autonomy.
With an undersea earthquake, one of the biggest in recorded history. That triggered a tsunami, which by the time it came ashore here in the Indonesian province of Aceh was a wave maybe 20, maybe 30 meters high. It hit the shore at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and it kept on going. It pushed miles inland, heading towards the regional capital, Banda Aceh. It smashed into the first houses and kept going. By the time it had finished, maybe 160,000 people were dead or dying. The entire city had more or less been destroyed. A decade later, and as you might expect, the city has made a dramatic recovery. There's no hint, really, here of the scars left by the tsunami. The place is bustling and it's peaceful. It's important to remember that there used to be a terrible separatist conflict here in Aceh. The tsunami had a catalytic effect, ending that conflict almost immediately, and the peace is still holding here. One result of that is that Aceh is now more autonomous, which means that there is Sharia law which has been imposed with increasing strictness. Some people like that. They feel that the tsunami was a punishment from God. But other people are worried that Sharia law is starting to scare away the foreign investment many here believe this province badly needs. I've come to a multi-story escape building, one of several built here along the coastline, just in case another tsunami should strike Aceh. And you get a sense from up here of how the $7 billion raised after the tsunami by the international community has been spent. I remember coming to this port area of Ulele just after the tsunami. There was nothing here. Every tree, every building had been destroyed. And now look at it. These are some of the 140,000 homes built by the international community since the tsunami. No, not all of them are occupied. Yes, some of them are more safe, more well-built than others. But overall, it's been a success. There are 2,000 miles, 3,500 kilometers of new roads built as well. And when you talk to people here in Banda Aceh in particular, nobody is going to forget for a second what happened, but overall, pretty much everyone says that their lives, their economy is better now than it was before the tsunami.
In Sri Lanka, however, the peace process stalled again. Eventually, the newly elected president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, officially abandoned the 2002 ceasefire and launched a military offensive, finally eliminating the Tamil Tigers in 2009 amid widespread allegations of grave human rights abuses and civilian casualties.
The advance needed 10 months, but at the end it took just a few hours for the Sri Lankan army to take control of the town of Mullaitivu, the Tamil Tigers' last major stronghold. The fighting was intense, the army said, but in the end they had too many men and too much firepower for the rebels.
It was a hard battle and it was intense fighting. We were expecting a bigger fight. Of course, they fought along the bands, but due to our maneuvers, I think they were outflanked and were taken by surprise.
It was captured on Sunday, the latest in a string of military successes which has changed the face of this conflict, and these are the first pictures from the town. This was once a lively hub of Tamil Eelam, the Tigers' self-proclaimed state that at its height stretched from Jaffna in the north to Batticaloa in the east. In Mullaitivu there is no longer the Tamil Tigers, Tamil civilians, or the notion of Tamil Eelam. For the Tigers and their followers, shattered dreams and shattered lives. The army has paid a price too. Before reaching the town they suffered high casualties, overcoming a string of defences like these heavily fortified bunds that ringed Mullaitivu. It came down to hand-to-hand fighting.
We had a fair number of casualties, yes. But the morale was very high. Very high. Troops want to get at the bund and cross over the bund. That was their intention. So they were highly committed and they put their 100%.
The army is pushing the Tigers back metre by metre, and a big part of their success has been the complete control in the air, enabling attack and reconnaissance. Fighting in the jungle would hamper that.
The battle is now raging about 1.5 kilometres away from here, where the army says the Tamil Tigers are resisting fiercely. But inch by inch they're pushing them back to the place they will have to make their last stand, and that is the thick jungles around here.
The Tigers waged a war from the jungles 25 years ago, and it is feared they could once again pursue a guerrilla campaign from the dense bush of the north.
And the troops are trained, so fighting in jungles would not cause a problem to the Sri Lankan army troops.
In the last year, this army division took nearly 700 square kilometres of territory and killed more than 2,000 Tamil Tigers. But in this time, less than 200 Tamil civilians have gone over to the government side. They say it's because the Tigers are forcefully using them as a human shield. But the Tigers say the civilians are fearful of government abuse. No one knows for sure. There is no independent corroboration of any of the claims. But in Mullaitivu, the army is digging in, perhaps as a precaution against a massive Tamil Tiger counteroffensive that many feared but hasn't happened. It shows that this war may still have some way to go. Tony Bertley, Al Jazeera.
So why were the outcomes in response to this common shock, a devastating tsunami, so different? We'll discuss these cases in more detail in class, but one important part of the story has to do with the way the two groups were funded. While poverty and marginal livelihoods can motivate participation in rebellion, hungry, desperate individuals without access to basic necessities, as we've noted, do not make the most formidable fighters. Fighting forces need resources to keep stomachs full and bullets in the chamber. So a big part of the story revolves around how these two groups mobilized resources, i.e., how they were funded. In both cases, the tsunami had disastrous effects for rebel-controlled territory, Aceh in the case of Indonesia, and Jaffna in the case of Sri Lanka. For GAM, whose primary resource base was the local Achenese population, the tsunami destroyed and displaced the livelihoods of their financial supporters, shrunk their resource base to fund and fight, and forced them to the negotiating table. In contrast, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam's access to a large diaspora population, particularly in Europe and Canada, allowed them to continue to sustain their war aims by soliciting voluntary, and in many instances, allegedly involuntary, contributions from the Tamil ethnic group living abroad.
In the Tamil neighbourhood in Paris, most shopkeepers are showing their support for Prabhakaran, the Tamil Tiger leader. Here, people are reluctant to believe he's really dead, even if footage of his corpse has been broadcast around the world on television.
I think that's not his body. C'était lui qui nous devait prendre la liberté. S'il est mort, vraiment, c'est vraiment déçu.
The news trickles through to local residents. In an internet cafe, Tamils are checking news coming from the island.
On dit que voilà, c'est fini, nous sommes vivants en paix ensemble. Bien, correct, Tamil, tout Tamil, Singalais, Muslim, tout le monde en pays, en peuple.
And when we ask him if he's a supporter of the Tamil Tigers, he chooses not to answer, wary of revealing too much and perhaps scared of reprisals. Some consider the Tamil Tigers to be a terrorist faction, but in this neighbourhood they're held up as freedom fighters. Locals deny that the Tigers demand financial support from the Sri Lankan diaspora.
Ils n'ont jamais forcé à personne. Ils ont demandé à votre volonté. S'ils demandent à moi, ils n'ont jamais proposé, voilà, vous versez tel montant. Ils ont demandé minimum ça. Si moi je donnais 50 € ou bien 100 €, ils ont accepté.
Here, the major cause for concern is the welfare of Tamil civilians in Sri Lanka.
Europe has not been able to resolve the conflict, so it should at least send humanitarian aid for the civilians, food and drink.
So while poverty and marginal livelihoods can motivate participation in rebellion, desperate individuals are not good fighters. So the immediate effect of natural disasters is typically to increase grievances, but actually tamp down the fighting capabilities of potential dissidents. In complex emergencies, emergency food and financial assistance are often vital for preventing further loss of life. But this assistance, if not carefully designed, can actually worsen conflict dynamics. Now, because emergency food shipments to conflict zones are somewhat fungible, i.e., they can be captured and resold or consumed by armed actors, they constitute an often unintended form of material support for rebels. Give a person a fish and she or he eats for a day. Give a person a fish in a conflict zone and a warlord steals it, resells it, and outfits a few more technicals, or repurposed pickup trucks turned into light combat vehicles.
Wild story of the Texas plumber whose company truck, with its logo and phone number still on it, somehow ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters and in a propaganda video. He is now suing the dealer that resold the car, and ABC's David Wright is here with that story. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Robin. You know, they say there's no such thing as bad publicity. Well, let me tell you about this plumber. He's had free advertising worldwide of the worst sort. His pickup truck ending up on the front lines of Syria, featured prominently in ISIS propaganda. So he's now filing suit. The black Ford F-250 still has his logo, but the dudes who now drive it clearly aren't interested in fixing any leaks.
My secretary called me and said, "You can't believe this."
That's his old truck, now 7,000 miles away from Texas City, Texas, with quite the gun rack in back. There it is in action. ISIS militants firing the anti-aircraft gun, the logo, and the company phone number, as clear as the intentions of those ISIS militants in the
To be fair, a government official might have that food aid confiscated, sell it on the black market, or sock the money away in an offshore account. The point being that it's introducing an additional resource base into a conflict zone that can be repurposed by malfeasant actors. Second, the provision of food and basic social services by the international community, even if imperfect, releases some of the pressure on both the government and the rebels to negotiate a settlement. Any move that makes an intractable, grinding stalemate more tolerable reduces incentives to end it. Third, humanitarian interventions that address basic needs may actually free up more time for engaging in politics and resisting governments and their allies. It may do nothing to address the underlying grievances, but may increase the fighting capability of the aggrieved population. For this reason, it's important humanitarian organizations tailor their humanitarian interventions in ways that can help reduce the likelihood of these resources fueling the very conflicts they are intended to help ease. This lecture has covered a variety of diverse topics. It's really a lot of territory related to the interplay between natural disasters, conflict, and human security. In our next lecture, we'll focus on how conflict affects the environment and whether co-management, that is, management by stakeholders, can help resolve conflicts and build durable peace in the aftermath of conflict.